afternoon, everyone. It is time to resume our sessions for the last panel of the day and of GCGC 2021. We'll have Nadya Malenko from Michigan presenting her paper about the voting premium, co-authored with Doran Levitt and Ernst Mogg.
Thank you very much for having our paper on the program. And Daron and Ernst are here in the audience as well. So this is a paper about the voting premium. Shareholder voting is a central mechanism of corporate governance. It empowers shareholders to elect directors, approve major corporate transactions, and decide on ESG issues. And because cash flow and voting rights are bundled together in shares, the desire to accumulate voting control and exert influence through voting can give rise to a voting premium on the price of the shares. The asset pricing implications of control rights have been studied extensively. Theoretically, the main argument, which has been very influential, links the takeover premium to takeovers and contests for control. However, certain empirical facts cannot be fully explained by this argument. First, the voting premium appears to be largest in economies where firms are well protected against takeovers and control contests hardly ever take place. Second, some papers have shown that the voting premium is largest around shareholder meetings compared to other periods of the year. Moreover, if we look at the large empirical literature that tries to estimate the voting premium, additional questions arise. So this table shows the results of 40 studies that use 5 different methodologies and the average estimate of the voting premium within each methodology. These studies report conflicting magnitudes of the voting premium, both across methodologies and within studies using the same methodology. Some studies report a voting premium that is indistinguishable from 0, which is quite different from other studies. And moreover, other studies report a negative voting premium for some companies in their sample. So overall, these gaps and conflicting conclusions suggest that the theoretical underpinnings of the voting premium are still incomplete. And to address these challenges, in this paper, we develop a unified theory of blockholder governance and voting premium. In our setting, there are minority blockholders and dispersed shareholders who trade and then vote their shares. And this is motivated by well-established evidence that minority blockholders are common in developed economies, and they often exercise power through the voting process. In this setting, the firm's ownership structure, voting outcomes, and asset prices are all endogenous and give rise to a voting premium. And that allows us to study its determinants and try to understand and interpret the empirical evidence that I told you about. So to see how we do this, let me present the model. In our framework, shareholders trade and then vote the shares they own. So they trade in the baseline model. There is one class of shares. They trade in a competitive market. There is a blockholder and dispersed shareholders. And they trade from some initial endowments and trade optimal amounts for them. Importantly, the blockholder never becomes a controlling shareholder. So we focus on the case of minority blockholders. And also the baseline model is one blockholder, but we have an extension to multiple blockholders that has similar features. After the trade, shareholders receive news about the proposal. You can think of this news as disclosure by management or recommendations of proxy advisory firms. And then shareholders vote the shares they own. You can think of an M&A proposal, a proxy fight, or ESG issues. And importantly, the vote base is endogenous. It is determined by the trading decisions. Shareholders who buy more shares will have more voting power. We assume that shareholders have heterogeneous preferences regarding the proposal, and I will refer to these preferences as biases. And by assuming this, we rely on substantial empirical evidence that shows that the preferences of shareholders are heterogeneous across multiple dimensions: governance philosophy, social and political ideology, time horizon, and others. And that this heterogeneity in preferences manifests itself in how shareholders vote. Specifically, a shareholder with bias B towards the proposal votes in favor of the proposal if this public signal about the value of the proposal and his bias together, the sum is positive. And that means that a shareholder with a large bias towards the proposal who likes the proposal will require relatively little evidence to vote in its favor. So when voting, he will apply a low cutoff on this signal to vote in favor. On the other hand, shareholder with a small bias who dislikes the proposal will require a lot of evidence to vote in its favor and applies a high cutoff on this public signal. So let's see how these individual voting decisions translate into aggregate voting outcomes. So let's look at how total votes in favor of the proposal depend on the realization of the news about the proposal. So first, consider the votes of dispersed shareholders. Quite intuitively, the more positive is the news about the proposal, the more shareholders are who are convinced that the proposal is beneficial for them. So this curve is increasing. In addition, there is a blockholder who has this bias, and the blockholder follows a similar cutoff strategy. So once the news receives this cutoff, there is an additional block of shares, alpha plus Y, so the blockholder's endowment plus the newly traded shares that are voted in favor of the proposal. So altogether, this is the overall support for the proposal as a function of the public signal. And this jump implies that the blockholder has influence on the voting outcome. He's pivotal with a strictly positive probability. So how are decisions made? Suppose the decision rule is simple majority. Then the proposal is approved if more than 50% of shareholders vote in its favor, which means it will be approved if the public signal exceeds this cutoff Q star. You can think of it as the decision rule that shareholders follow. And also you can think of this Q star as essentially the decision cutoff of the median shareholder, the median voter, the voter with median preferences among the post-trade shareholder base. Note that in general, the blockholder is different from the median voter, which means that the decision is not fully aligned with the blockholder's preferences. However, by trading, the blockholder can affect the median voter and through this exert influence on the voting outcome. In particular, suppose the blockholder buys more, so we increase Y, the number of shares he buys. Then he owns a larger block of shares. And in addition, dispersed shareholders anticipate that the decision rule will be different and also trade differently. So all this, as you can see, moves the median voter closer to the blockholder. So by buying shares, the blockholder makes the decision rule more aligned with his preferences. And at some point, if he buys a large enough amount, he even becomes the median voter himself, in which case the decision rule is fully aligned with his preference. Note that after that, further buying of shares doesn't change the median voter anymore. That's still the blockholder, even though the blockholder still holds less than the majority of the shares. So now that we understand how trading affects voting, let's look at the trading stage. For any given trade Y of the blockholder, anticipating the decision rule Q star, we just saw how it depends on the blockholder's trades, the share price is determined by market clearing. And to understand what will be the equilibrium share price and to understand the implications for the voting premium, we need to understand how much the blockholder will optimally trade in equilibrium. We show that the blockholder has two motives. The first motive is the cash flow motive. Because shareholders have heterogeneous preferences regarding the proposal, they have different valuations of the shares, and that creates gains from trade. In addition, the blockholder specifically also has a voting motive to trade. As we saw, by buying shares, the blockholder moves the median voter towards his direction. This voting motive will be key for the voting premium, so let's understand it a little bit further by looking at the blockholder's payoff, which is given by this expression. So the first component captures the value of the blockholder's stake. This term is the blockholder's valuation of any single share given his bias, and this is how many shares he buys, the endowment plus the newly traded shares Y. The second component is how much he needs to pay for these newly traded shares, and then there are also some trading costs. So now we can see both motives to trade. What is the effect of an additional share that the blockholder buys on his payoff? The cash flow motive is captured by the direct effect of Y on the blockholder's payoff. And if that were the only motive to trade, and the decision rule were taken as given, then the blockholder would buy this amount of shares, Y cash flow. However, the blockholder also has this voting motive to trade. And this is captured by the indirect effect through the influence on the voting rule. In particular, by buying an additional share, the blockholder can move the median voter, and the change in the median voter affects his payoff, both by affecting his own valuation of the shares and by affecting the price at which he is buying the shares. So this voting motive to trade means that the blockholder will buy a different amount than if he were trading purely for cash flow reasons. He would buy some amount Y star. So now we can understand how the voting premium arises. When the blockholder trades, he faces an upward sloping supply curve from dispersed shareholders. If the blockholder only traded for cash flow reasons, taking the decision rule as given, then the price would be given by this function as a function of this Y cash flow. However, because the blockholder also has a voting motive to trade, the equilibrium price is different. And this difference between the two prices is our definition of the voting premium. Importantly, this voting premium defined this way has an appealing empirical counterpart. It captures the dual class share premium. We show it by considering an extension to two classes of shares, voting and non-voting, and showing that this price differential captures the difference in prices between voting and non-voting shares. And the dual class share premium is the common way to empirically estimate the voting premium. However, we emphasize that the voting premium definition is generalizable to any firm, not necessarily with two classes of shares, because this voting premium component will be always present in the share price. And the easiest way to think of the voting premium is the price differential right before versus right after the record date. At these 2 points in time, the expected decision rule is the same, and the only thing that changes is that shares lose their voting rights. So now that we understand how the voting premium emerges, let's consider the implications. Our first implication is that the voting premium generally underestimates the value of voting rights. And to see this, note that if the blockholder is the median voter, then the voting premium is zero. Indeed, if we consider the cash flow and the voting motive to trade, the second voting motive to trade is zero if the blockholder is the median voter. If you remember, once he becomes the median voter, he can no longer affect the identity of the median voter by further buying the shares. But the fact that the voting premium is zero doesn't mean that the value of the voting rights to the blockholder is zero or small. The voting outcome has been affected by the blockholder's accumulation of shares because the blockholder was not the median voter at his initial endowment. He moved the median vote and changed the voting outcome. And this difference arises because the voting premium reflects the marginal rather than the average willingness to buy shares. Our second implication is that the voting premium doesn't emerge from exercising control, but rather emerges from influencing who exercises control. And specifically, the voting premium arises exactly because the voting premium can affect the identity of the median voter, can move who is influencing the decision rule by his shares, even if the blockholder himself has a small stake. In fact, the voting premium can be negatively related to the blockholder's voting stake. To see this, suppose that the blockholder buys few shares in equilibrium. His stake is small and his probability of being pivotal is small. Then, as we saw, the blockholder is not the median voter. One of the dispersed shareholders is the median voter. And this means that the voting premium is positive. The blockholder would like to buy additional shares and make the decision rule even more aligned with his preferences, but he doesn't do so because it is too costly for cash flow reasons, because voting and cash flow rights are bundled in shares. In contrast, if the blockholder trades a lot and becomes the median voter himself, then the voting premium becomes zero. So this comparison shows the negative relation between the voting premium and the blockholder's voting power. Our third implication is that the voting premium can be negative. And this is consistent with several empirical papers that document a negative voting premium for several companies in their samples. And to see the intuition, consider proposals that concerns the firm's environmental and social policies. For example, suppose that the blockholder and dispersed shareholders both favor the adoption of an environmentally friendly production technology. And moreover, suppose that dispersed shareholders favor this environmentally friendly production technology even more than the blockholder. As the blockholder buys shares, remember, he moves the median voter in his preferred direction. So that benefits the blockholder and increases the value of his stake. However, it also benefits the dispersed shareholders because they also like the environmentally friendly production. Essentially, what happens, shareholders benefit from the blockholder's accumulation of shares. Their valuation of shares increases, and now they demand a higher price to sell their shares to the blockholder, free riding on his accumulation of shares. As a result, if the blockholder buys, the price which captures shareholders' valuations increases even more than the blockholder's own valuation, exactly because shareholders are even more environmentalist than the blockholder. And that means that this price impact of trade is too strong, and the value of control becomes negative. The blockholder prefers not to accumulate voting rights to avoid increasing the price by so much. And as a result, he buys fewer shares than if he were buying purely for cash flow reasons. That gives rise to a negative voting premium that is consistent with these several studies. Now, this logic also leads to our fourth implication. We show that the price impact of the blockholder's trades, which is a common measure of liquidity, arises endogenously due to voting considerations. And the reason is that, as I just explained, as the blockholder accumulates shares and moves the median voter, shareholders' valuations change because they anticipate different decision-making policies. In particular, if the blockholder and dispersed shareholders' interests are aligned in that the move of the median voter benefits dispersed shareholders, then their valuations increase, and that increases the price impact of the blockholder's trade, reducing the liquidity of the shares. On the other hand, if the interests of the blockholder and dispersed shareholders are not aligned, are in conflict, so that the movement in the median voter hurts dispersed shareholders and decreases their valuations, then the price impact is lower, so liquidity is high. So overall, this suggests that the liquidity of voting and non-voting shares will generally differ, and which of these two types of shares is more liquid depends on the conflict or alignment of interest between the blockholder and dispersed shareholders. In the paper, we have some other implications. We show that the tension between exit and voice arises in our model as well, and that exit can be consistent with a positive voting premium. We analyze the premium in block trades, and the block premium reflects the value of the entire block of votes being sold rather than the marginal value of the vote. And we also analyze the market for votes and emphasize that the price of a vote that is traded separately from cash flow rights is fundamentally different from the price of vote that is traded in combination with cash flow rights. So let me now go back and try to interpret the empirical evidence that I started my presentation with in the context of our model. So first, our paper shows how the voting premium can arise in economies where takeovers and contests for control hardly ever take place. In our setting, the voting premium arises because minority blockholders exercise influence through the voting process. It is also consistent with the evidence that the voting premium is largest around shareholder meetings compared to other periods of the year. We emphasize that estimates of the voting premium that are close to zero don't mean that votes are not important or are not valuable to their owners. And this is because of this difference between the marginal versus the average value of the vote. And this also means, for example, that the estimates based on the block trade premium, which captures the value of the block, could be quite different. Finally, our model rationalizes a negative voting premium, which has been documented in several studies. So to conclude, our paper presents a unified theory of blockholder governance and the voting premium, and we focus on the asset pricing implications of the blockholder governance and offer a reinterpretation of the existing empirical measures of the voting premium. Thank you, and I very much look forward to the discussion and your comments.
Thank you, Nadya. Now, Professor Ernst-Ludwig von Thadden from the University of Mannheim in Germany will provide comment.
Thanks for having me on this program, and in particular, thanks for having me discuss this paper, which is a beautiful one, and it was a pleasure to read, and it is not exactly trivial, so it's great fun to work through it, and I'm grateful to Nadya that she has presented these intuitions so well, because some of the formulas are unpleasant, and so I don't have to bother you with those, and can move, hopefully, right into my discussion of the paper. So, as Nadya has, I think, made it very clear, this is a paper that asks a very simple but very basic and important question. And it's sort of like with many very good papers, the issue is really, why haven't people asked that question before? But you will see that it's in fact not exactly easy to address this question, and so maybe there's a good reason that this hasn't done before. So the paper asks the following deceptively simple question: why is there a stock premium on shares bought by blockholders, even if these blocks are too small to directly control the vote in a general shareholder assembly or the outcome of a tender offer? So as Nadya pointed out, papers on corporate control and corporate governance very often consider the issue of who is able to win a tender offer or a majority contest. This is not the issue here. We're talking about smaller stakes and how do these smaller stakes play out. And the answer may be sort of at first sight, yeah, of course you want more shares because you can have more influence or something like that. No, but I mean, it's definitely not as easy as that. And the subtle answer that the paper is providing is what I wrote down here. It's from the paper. This is because in a vote, there is a difference between being pivotal and being the median voter. And so this is almost the summary of the paper. It really depends on how far you want to dig. And given Nadya's work, I don't have to go too far. Let me, at the moment, just link this to the first day of the conference. Remember Alan's paper that he presented yesterday. In fact, it's sort of funny. We could have had a very nice session on the theory on empirics of blockholders or corporate governance with blocks. The quote here I have, in fact, is right. It's a quote from his slides. So I don't know where, but so I could recite that. So his question was, do retail investors matter for corporate voting outcomes? And the answer is, in fact, up here. No, this is exactly why they matter. He didn't make that so clear yesterday, maybe because he hadn't seen Nadya's paper before very carefully. But this is the answer to the question Alan was asking yesterday. So, of course, retail investors matter for corporate votings. And clearly, they vote sort of, they matter for simple legal reasons. They have the right to vote. But more subtly, they have, in fact, a role to play in how sort of the larger interests are being played out. And this is what this paper now is looking at. And so the reason is, in fact, again, as Nadya said, the voting premium on shares does not emerge from exercising control, but rather from influencing who exercises control. And so that means this is where the retail investors come in, because they are the ones who will express their view, but they will express their view in a way that has been framed or that has been set up by the blockholder in the model. And the argument is that in a strategic voting game, and we'll maybe talk about the notion of games a little bit later, which is not exactly clear in the paper. In the strategic voting game, disentangle the marginal profits from additional cash flow and the marginal profit from additional voting rights. So the first one is well known. We have been talking about this since Grossman-Hart 88 and whatever. And the marginal profit from additional voting rights is much less well understood. And this is where this paper comes in and tries to clarify what's going on. What I want to do in my discussion is I want to ask a few, or want to address a few issues, but hope to be constructive because it's literally what came to my mind when I was reading that paper. So the first question I really had when reading the paper was, what are blockholders, in fact? And sort of that is something which one needs to be quite careful about, because in the paper in LMM, a blockholder is defined by two distinct features, and it's quite important to understand what these features do to the theory. First, she owns a block, and that is, let's say, alpha, if you are in the basic model of shares, and she's the only one to own such a block in the basic model. And that is basically the theory I'm going to discuss, and that's the theory that is mostly discussed in the paper, I should also say. And the second point that defines a blockholder is she publicly trades a quantity Y, and she does this before dispersed shareholders. That's how it is set up. So she has, in fact, two roles. And I was wondering which one is crucial, or maybe both are crucial. In fact, it turns out that the block ownership is not really crucial, because the whole theory goes through for alpha equals 0. That means a blockholder who has no block. And in fact, it turns out that if you have no block, quite intuitively, as proposition 3 is saying, that the voting premium is mostly negative, but that's something that must be discussed in a little bit more detail. In any case, the theory goes through for blockholders that don't have blocks. In fact, the question then is the second bullet point really required? And in fact, no, it's not really required either. The specific timing structure is actually not relevant either. In particular, this is not a paper about asymmetric information. So it's not that the quantity Y transmits any information that is useful later on. And in fact, the dispersed shareholders do not condition on Y either. That is not always exactly clear, but when you look at the formula, it's clear. So they maximize simply by looking at prices and their own valuations. So in that sense, they have bounded rationality. They're not using the information that they could use, namely the quantity Y that is assumed to have been revealed before. But in fact, they understand the cutoff point QE star, which is rational expectations. So these people are somewhat limited, boundedly rational. But in any case, here's just a small remark, which you may want to look at, Nadya. It's not a big deal. Formula 10 is a little bit misleading, because here it's not demand for shares that depends on Y, but it's in fact equilibrium trades of shares that depend on Y. So that's an equilibrium relation. Upshot is here, it's neither important that the blockholder has many shares, nor is it important that she trades publicly before the shareholders. The only thing that matters is that blockholders have price impact and use this price impact strategically. So that's what the paper understands by the word blockholder, and there is something to that. It's a strategic instrument, and of course the paper is about strategic voting and strategic trading in the context of voting. So let me now turn to the issue of multiple blockholders, now that I have clarified what a single blockholder is. And of course, now the question of what a single blockholder is becoming even more important, because there are many small shareholders in firms, and there are many shareholders who would like to be taken seriously in the sense of influencing the trades of others. And the question is, how does that happen? So I've just written down here a large company close to where I live, SAP, the software firm in Waldorf. So the 4 biggest shareholders of SAP hold something between 3% and 6% of SAP each. These are two very different groups of people. The first 2 are the initial founders, and the other 2 are BlackRock and Vanguard. So, and then there's a couple of investors who hold something between 0.5 and 1%. So in that sense, there's a lot of blockholders around. And so the question, what do blockholders actually do in such a situation, is important. And fortunately, Nadya was kind enough to provide an online appendix in which the 3 of them, discuss what the blockholders in fact do when there are several of them. They have two examples here, many similar blockholders, in which case the voting premium disappears, so the theory becomes a little bit less, let's say, interesting, although it's clearly what you would expect. And then an extreme case with two blockholders with extreme opposing views, where the voting premium becomes very important. So there is discussion in the online appendix about what I would consider as the most important issue to consider. And in fact, next to that, I would think it would also be important to look at, in fact, what Alan was also discussing on Friday, namely the story of many different small shareholders. And so in Nadya's paper, there are homogeneous continuum of small shareholders. What we have learned from Alan was that, in fact, there are different types of dispersed shareholders of different account sizes and sophistication. And in fact, there is a correlation between stake size and voting turnout. So there's a whole life in this group of anonymous atomistic shareholders in Levitt et al. And so the conclusion for this first comment is, as usual with good and elegant simple models, the reality is more complex. Several relatively small but non-atomistic shareholders with some limited price impact and some voting impact. And the question is, how do those interact strategically? And what we have seen in the paper is really looking at two extreme outcomes in this continuum of possibilities. And I'm pretty sure that this is very much informative, but it's definitely not conclusive as far as I can see. Second comment, since I'm running out of time already, let me quickly, let me skip that. Let me just come to a discussion which is, I think, useful also for the audience to understand the paper better, because that's something where the paper is a little bit, let's say, a little bit brief on the practical or empirical side. So what we have and what the paper models is, we have a vote which is forthcoming at general shareholders assembly or whatever, and you have trading of shareholders who may realign their shareholdings, and then there's a public signal at which excuse me, a public signal at which people learn about the value of the proposal to be voted on. And before that, of course, there is a record date, and the record date is the crucial date at which it is determined who's allowed to vote. So the paper is explicit about that, and so we have first trading, and then at the date which I discuss in a second, it is clear who is a shareholder, and then people continue being shareholders or not, depending on what they did here. There's a public signal, and a few weeks later, often there's a vote. So very reasonable, basic trading and information structure. But of course, you can think about much richer structures. And I think these richer structures are important because that's what reality really is. Namely, there's more trading potentially going on, and there's potentially more signals being around. And so the question is, how does that affect this very basic analysis that we have just seen? So for example, you could have trading after the signal, which would be up here. So now people have recorded their ownership, and they may already trade out of the stock for various reasons that we could discuss in the model. And this is not unreasonable because they have seen the signal and there may be scope for trading. Also, you could, for example, have private information before the record date. And so that means there may be signals here which lead to different types of trading. So these are two examples that are relevant in practice. And what I've given here is a very nice paper by Fos and Fos-Holderness. In fact, a ECGI working paper of April this year, so very recent, which talks about exactly this problem. So it really comes along your way very nicely, Nadya. And I'm sure, in fact, you know it, I'm pretty sure, but it would be nice to discuss that in your paper as well. Because what struck me when I read the Fos-Holderness paper is that, in fact, things are much more unclear than your beautifully simple description suggests. In fact, they were surprised by how unclear things are in terms of legal terms in practice. And so let me just give you the facts of the Fos-Holderness paper as a contrast or as a complement to what Nadya told you in her model. So a couple of findings which are in fact quite interesting and which we would now have to reconcile with the predictions and descriptions of the LMM paper. So finding one, trading volume increases before the record date. It declines around the record date and can increase, but not always, after that date. That is a richer prediction than what you have in your model. And in particular, it points to the fact that it may be important to include a second round of trading in the model to really make sure that you capture everything that's going on. Second finding, stock prices decline after the record day. So that is certainly consistent with what you have, at least I think you could argue it is. Most of this is driven by votes involving proposals by dissident shareholders. Dissident shareholders are shareholders with potentially large Bs in your model. So that's something which you could in fact work on and see whether this is true. I think it is, but the model by as such is currently, I think, too simple to address it. Finding three, for some important votes, and important in that paper is defined as being controversial and close, there is little trading activity around the record day. For other important votes, there are market changes in trading volume and stock prices. So it seemed to be that not everything is going the same way. So there's heterogeneity, which is potentially in the spirit of what you are discussing, but it would be nice to see how it really fits in. The most interesting and surprising findings, though, are the findings that this is all a big mess, practically speaking. And I was quite amazed to see that. They were amazed as well. In fact, it's not at all easy to say what is the record day and how do things play out. So your nice game, the strategic timeline that you wrote down, Nadya, seems to be completely unclear in practice. And here's finding 4. In 91% of all cases they study, and they claim to have a very large sample, which I guess it's true, given Cliff's reputation. Firms file a proxy notifying shareholders of the record date after the date. So that means it's not even clear whether you are trading before the record date or after the record date for most people. And in fact, it's even worse. The NYSE, where most of these firms are listed, they are looking at, requires that firms notify the exchange 10 days prior to the record date. And when you think that this is good news, it's not. However, the NYSE does not inform the public. It rather sells the information at a high price to select individuals. I couldn't believe that when I read it, but I mean, you can read it yourself. It's an ECGI discussion paper. And so that means that much of the trading structure that you are using and I was discussing in my previous comments is in fact not exactly clear. And there may in particular a strong role for private information that you don't model at all. Okay, I skipped the next slide, which I sent you the slides, so you will see that. I think there are 1 or 2 things that one may want to look at more technically. In particular, this gamma cost here is something which I'm not fully sure I understand, and you need it, it's important, and so one would have to think a little bit more about why trading, in fact, is really unpleasant in the stock market. And the other thing is you mentioned multiple equilibria. Let me simply quote from Franklin Allen's slide of yesterday. I noted that from the screen. The possibility of multiple equilibria is mentioned in section 4.2. Is this important, and what can be said about this issue? So just recycle what was said, and in fact, that is an interesting finding that you have, and it would be nice to understand whether this is a problem or whether there's an opportunity for your analysis. And sorry, Mariana, it was a little bit longer than I had hoped, but almost in time. A fine piece of theory diligent in execution, and rich in discussion, set in symmetric information in a field that is mostly concerned with asymmetric information, which I view as a plus. Symmetric information is simpler, but of course, much of what's happening may be due to asymmetric information, and you may have to worry about it. And the more, let's say, nuanced final statement, the distinction between pivotal and median voters is insightful and appealing. How will it fare in the complex world of many asymmetrically informed small blockholders and managers documented, e.g. by Fos-Holderness? So you have some more work to do, but I'm excited by your agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernst. Nadya, would you like to briefly respond before I collect additional questions?
Sure. Thank you so much for this constructive and positive discussion. So just a few points, there were many. So yeah, we should definitely emphasize the difference, right, between the blockholders and discuss shareholders and what exactly distinguishes between them. As you point out, with multiple blockholders, we probably should bring this more into the paper. There are very similar forces, but for example, what we show is there is a big difference whether these multiple blockholders are aligned or are in conflict, and maybe we should emphasize this more and related to the main findings. Timing, yes, very, very interesting. So just to clarify the way we think about the timing, this public signal, we think about it, for example, as the recommendations of proxy advisory firms, which typically come before about 2 weeks before the vote after the record date. So that's our rationale for the timing. And the paper by Slaver and Cliff is very interesting. So I think our model could probably easily incorporate this uncertainty about whether the record date is before the trade or has already something happened or after the trade. So right now we assume it's 100% after the trade, but with uncertainty that would probably decrease, right, the magnitudes, and that would be consistent with they do observe a volume around the record date and the price drop, which is consistent with our paper, but their magnitudes are sort of small, so that would be consistent, right, with this uncertainty about the timing of the record date. So we should probably extend the model to capture this. And yes, information asymmetry, that's definitely very important. All of us have worked on information asymmetry in voting, as you know. So for this setting specifically, we wanted to abstract from information asymmetry issues and focus on the simplest setting that give rise to the voting premium, given this evidence about heterogeneity in preferences. But yeah, absolutely, it would be important to think about it. Thank you again.
Congratulations on such a fine piece of work. It seems to me that your work interacts with work that's been done by Josh Schmitz at Columbia on short sales. Because if we're thinking about the difference between a median voter and a pivotal voter, and the extra price for that, the short sale market might be a very good one to examine, because presumably the, I mean, as Josh shows, the price, the short sale value can vary a lot depending on the nature of the vote and other factors, and that might be a good place both to motivate some of what you show, but also to get some data that adds energy to the claim about the nature of what counts as the reason why you might see a premium for voting.
Okay, yeah, maybe let me respond. Yes, thank you. We should definitely look into that. So we've looked. We have some extension that I haven't had time to discuss about separation of cash flow and voting rights. And for example, the share lending market, right, is one way to separate votes from cash flow rights. And one thing that emerges from there is that the price of a vote in this share lending market, when they are separately traded, like you said, right, separately from cash flow rights, is very different and would give rise to a different price than when it's bundled, like for example in dual class share settings. So we should definitely look at this paper and relate to it. Thank you.
Rolf?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Nadya, for an excellent presentation. Extremely interesting. I can't help thinking a bit about the relationship between your study and Christian Rydqvist's study in 1988. And I noticed you had it there in the list of references. Now, Christian applied the theory of oceanic games, but I think the outcome, as I recall it, when we worked together, the major outcome of his study was just this value of the pivotal vote, so to say. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on the relationship? That would be great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the way we see the difference is that in Christian Rehnquist's paper, there are these atomistic shareholders, but they have a collective action problem, but somehow outside of the setting, he assumes that they resolve it and vote collectively, right? And that's essentially what makes them pivotal and gives rise to a voting premium. So what we don't assume that these atomistic shareholders can somehow collectively resolve the collective action problem. In our setting, each shareholder just cares about his own value and doesn't in any way coordinate with others. So that would be the difference.
Marco?
Yeah, I mean, just commenting on Edo's SAP example. So you had the founders and then you have BlackRock and company. Now, of course, it's always possible that an activist comes in. So it's not just the static picture, but it's actually, that's not a takeover, but it's, and you know, there will be a huge disagreement between the activist and the other people there. So I think in your appendix, that would be the example. Now, so what's then a situation where you don't have a disagreement? So it actually, you know, it doesn't matter that these small shareholders influence the outcome. And I think the only example you can think of is a case where somebody controls 50% of the votes, and there it really shouldn't matter. So what happens in such a situation in your model in a controlled company where the control is really clear, both in a takeover situation, but also if an activist comes in?
Right. Yeah. So right now we specifically assume that the blockholder never becomes the controlling shareholder. Yeah. Right. So suppose at the point when he's fully in control, right, after 50%, at this point, there is nothing, right? Neither the median voter changes, nor he just always determines fully the decision, right? So once he becomes the controlling blockholder, the identity of other shareholders doesn't really matter. And we want to. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it is the Global Corporate Governance Colloquium, and you can see Mariana who goes, you know, because we have Brazil and dual class and controllers, you know, and I think they do have voting premium with controllers, so that might be a problem.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to ask you a question about this, because you say that you study why a voting premium emerges in the absence of takeovers or controlling shareholders, which is arguably the empirically most relevant setting. I think I'm with you with the takeovers, but not quite with controlling shareholders. And I was curious about that because one thing that we see in many countries is that you have controlled companies with dual class shares. You see them around the world, now you see them in the United States, and you seem to refer to those studies that measure the voting premium in dual class shares for purposes of your context. But then I was a little bit confused about whether your model applies. I thought it didn't to companies that have controlling shareholders, which are absolutely not exceptional, not even in the US, among the very top, the largest companies today. So if you could say a little bit more about that, because it seems like that you might be trying to explain some evidence that covers a scenario that is different from the one you were discussing. So I was curious about that point as well.
And yeah, so maybe the confusion is the way, so we definitely don't want to say that the takeover setting, right, and this contest for control is not relevant. We definitely want to say it is relevant, that's why it has been influential, it explains part of the empirical evidence, but it doesn't explain, right, as I showed, there are many facts that cannot be explained just by by shareholders competing for majority control. So our goal in this paper was to specifically focus on the setting and show that the voting premium can arise without contest for control and majority blockholders. So we see it as complementary to the literature where there is controlling blockholders.
Hi, Lucian.
Yes, just a brief comment. I think that the focus of your paper, and there is a lot in it, it's about kind of the descriptive rather than normative analysis. And for this purpose, having this bias that you have, forget what's the notation, maybe B, is sufficient. You don't really need to specify what this B is. But I think that for people who will want to work with your framework and to think about what it means for policy, what it means for various things, it would be useful for you to kind of distinguish between different cases. So way back, people were doing those models. They had the cash flows and they had private benefits. So one explanation for the bias is that you have some private benefits, and then there's a question of whether that's part of the social welfare or not. And there is also the possibility, it seems like you have some sort of a preference that is not like a private benefit. You had some examples discussed in this forum. But I think that even though you don't need it for the model, it might be worthwhile for you to think about what is exactly the nature of it. Should it count as part of the social welfare? And lastly, my impression that if you look at most of the blockholders that might be considering those things, my guess is that they would probably be moved largely by private benefits of one sort or another, rather than I don't see Norges that might have kind of preferences of another kind going to increase its shares before the vote in order to affect the vote, whereas I do see, hedge funds that might have a minority position doing that. So I think that all of this, you could kind of try to expect to go further and provide a framework for others to follow by doing work that would specify what exactly is meant and what are the different possibilities for what this bias is.
I completely agree. That's a very good point. For example, right, the implications, whether these biases are coming from tax differences could be different versus if they're coming from some social preferences. And we have been potentially considering relating, for example, the size of the voting premium to welfare. So in our earlier paper where we didn't consider blockholders, we actually focused quite a lot on welfare. And there we considered, for example, social preferences versus not social preferences. So we can probably think of the same logic in the context of this paper and related to the voting premium. So that's a very good point.
Ernst?
Since we have a few moments, I can maybe ask something. I have many things to be discussed in this paper, but one question would be, I mean, this is about important votes at the General Shareholders Assembly. So, as I said, I mean, I would think about this paper more in terms of several blockholders, small blockholders, quite a number, and this is the way I think you should also maybe set it up, because that's sort of a natural framework. But now think about 3 different proposals being on the agenda, and people have different views about this one. Your theory definitely can't deal with that, because you are trading in order to push exactly one agenda, and now maybe these different Bs and betas get in each other's way. Is there a way of thinking about what happens in this type of context in the run-up to a shareholders assembly?
It's interesting. So one probable prediction would be with multiple blockholders, the voting premium was less likely to be 0, because even if you are a median voter, right, on one block proposal, you are less likely to be a median voter on all of these other proposals. So that would be one prediction. But then, of course, it will matter. So the size of the voting premium will be linked to which proposal is more important, right, and which of the biases like that would determine, right, in some sense, if we can measure the importance of the proposals. Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's a way of sort of getting a handle on this? I mean, your paper seems to be really tailored to this one big decisive shareholder meeting. So the one that happens in 10 years time, DuPont 2015 or whatever, and that's it. And the rest is something about other stories. Or do I overinterpret this?
Well, no, we were hoping we are being more general about this. So typically in many shareholder meetings, there are contentious proposals. So of course, we think about M&A or proxy fights. These are clearly important, but overall contentious proposals where proxy advisors give a recommendation that is against management, for example, or contentious ESG issues. So all of these, and usually within a meeting, I would say maybe there is often we can isolate, right, the most important proposal, right, the one that generates most controversy. And the way to think of our model is specifically, this is the proposal that we are thinking of.
Nadia, just a suggestion, if you ever want to go comparative on this, we know that the issues shareholders can vote on varies drastically across jurisdictions. So in some jurisdictions, shareholders can vote on a greater number of issues. And this is also relevant regarding the controlling shareholder context, because in some countries you do have controlling shareholders, but certain decisions are subject to a supermajority voting requirements or majority of the minority voting requirements. In other decisions, in Brazil, this is really rare. So if you are a majority controlling shareholder, you usually carry the day, and the votes of blockholders will always be minority votes. So this is something that you might want to look at in the
Absolutely.
future.
And we so the way I presented, we always had 50%, but in the model, this majority control is completely flexible. So we can look at how this majority control affects the size of the voting premium and the voting outcome. So that would be very interesting. Thank you.